Couple more bikes like this one, or couple more bikes too, no?
So you get them in all the time, different bikes. Okay.
Well, the first guy that you just heard in that clip there was a motorbike mechanic working freely in London despite being wanted for murder in Brazil. Authorities there have requested and been denied his extradition. So why have judges here ruled that would infringe his human rights? And how many more alleged criminals are walking our streets avoiding justice in Brazil and beyond? I'm Lucy Watson, and this is What You Need to Know. Joining me is our UK editor, Paul Brand, who has been investigating this. My instant thought was, how on earth did this story cross your path? How did you get it?
So this was tipped off to us by a source who was working on this area and looking into this particular issue, especially when it came to Brazilian fugitives. He'd seen case after case coming up in courts, because if you actually sit in somewhere like Westminster Magistrates Court that deals with extradition requests, you do see these cases coming through day after day after day. Yeah.
Observed in the courts.
Yeah, so he'd seen that these kept cropping up in the courts and that regularly the European Convention on Human Rights was being applied to block their extradition back to Brazil and other countries as well.
So, well, let's take these two men that feature in your report in turn. The one that we have just heard, and do correct me if I'm wrong, was a Nicolas Gomes de Brito, is that right? And so just tell me a little about him. Who is he? What's he accused of?
So he came here in 2019 and he is accused, although he at the moment hasn't stood trial, so he hasn't had a chance to clear his name out of his own choice because he fled here, but he is accused of murdering a rival gang member in Brazil in 2019, a gang shooting that was allegedly ordered by him. Immediately after that gang shooting, he came to the UK on a tourist visa, overstayed his visa, and ever since he's been living here. Now, Brazil asked for him to come back, and in 2022, I think it was, he had an extradition hearing, but he argued that if he was sent back to Brazil, his human rights would be violated under the European Convention on Human Rights inside Brazilian prisons, because Brazilian prisons tend to be overcrowded. There has been a history of violence in those prisons. They're not great. I mean, people would say our prisons aren't great in the UK either, quite frankly, but Brazilian prisons do have...
What prison is great?
Yeah.
They're not supposed to be, are they?
They're not supposed to be luxurious, but nevertheless, people do have a right not to be tortured or mistreated, and that's Article 3 of the European Convention. It says people must not be mistreated, including in prisons. So he successfully argued, and he's still here today.
So you used an undercover reporter on this, didn't you, who kind of, we can hear it in that clip and we can see it in your TV report going into where he was working. What were the kind of clues or things did he find out about his life in Brazil?
So we had the police report, so he was able to obtain the police report that goes through all the evidence that allegedly links De Brito to this gang shooting. So that was amazing evidence, and he met him on several different occasions. And what we tried to do was tease out of De Brito whether he would allude to this alleged crime. Yeah. So we asked him, do you have experience with guns? De Brito said, yeah, many times. I've carried a gun in Brazil. It's very dangerous in Brazil. There were problems in our area. We had to fight back, etc. So that all starts to sound...
So confirming your suspicions.
Yeah, it sounds like some kind of gang turf warfare. Yeah. And then the one that really, really raised our antennae was we asked De Brito for a specific example of where he'd had to use a gun or where he'd been in danger. And this is what he says in reply to the undercover reporter in this particular exchange, where he's talking about him being attacked. And this sounds very much like the attack that he is thought to have wanted revenge for. Listen to what he says. Okay.
Were you together with your friend?
Yeah, we were together. They come for both us, So they get one shoot on the back, Then they don't move his leg no more, But I was so angry. When this happened, I want to take the guy, 100%.
So the allegation is that his friend was shot in the back by, again, this is all gang warfare, and he was left paralysed by that. And De Brito is thought to have been so angry that he then ordered the killing of the rival gang member. Again, these are allegations. De Brito hasn't stood trial. But that sounds very much like the sort of scenario that police are talking about. So we thought that was really interesting, again, linked him to these allegations.
But the huge issue, the crux of this issue, basically, of this story is human rights. So how has De Brito claimed that his would be infringed. I know that you talked about but the prisons. If he was sent to face trial in Brazil, how would his rights be infringed?
Essentially because he would go to prison and he wouldn't be treated as well as he should be in prison because the prisons aren't good enough, essentially, is the argument. He also tried to argue in court that he was gay, that he was married to a man, that he'd come to the UK married to a Portuguese man. Nobody could find any evidence of this supposed husband. And actually what we found was evidence of a wife, which was quite interesting as well. So he'd post on social media pictures with a woman who appears to be the mother of his child, and he talked to our undercover reporters about his wife. He called her my wife and said, I came to the UK with my wife and my son. So that appears to be a lie, quite frankly. And again, we've given him an opportunity to reply to that and tell us it's not a lie. He's chosen not to do that. So we can only presume that he has misled the court there. Now, the judge didn't actually take that into account because the judge wasn't convinced either, actually, about his claims about sexuality.
So that was put to one side.
That was put to one side, but could have been a factor if the judge had been convinced. Yeah. And the pure factor that came into play was this issue with Brazilian prisons.
Now, this, of course, applies to any country. We're not just talking about Brazil. But today, you and I are. How many more cases are there like this?
So we know with Brazil, there have been about 300 extradition requests from Brazil. That's over the period of about a decade. And those figures are a couple of years out of date because they haven't been updated for a while from the National Crime. Could be more. But there have only been a handful of arrests, something like 4, maybe 6, we think, because there have been a couple since the data finished. So we're not even arresting them, really. And then it's when they're arrested, they then go to this extradition hearing, and some of them are successfully then challenging their extradition and not going back to Brazil. So in reality, we are deporting very, very few of these suspects.
And some of them potentially really hard.
Yeah, what I would definitely, as a father, consider to be one of the worst human beings on the planet is Marlon Martins dos Santos, right? So we talked about De Brito and allegations.
Yep.
Well, with Marlon Martins dos Santos, it is proven
I'm taking
that he
an inhale
is
breath here.
Exactly this is a really bad one, and I'm really sorry if anyone is feeling sensitive about hearing this, but we have to put it on the table that he is a convicted paedophile who repeatedly raped a 5-year-old girl. Again, the pattern was the same. He fled to the UK. Brazil said, bring him back. He needs to be in one of our prisons. And at his extradition request, no, you can't send him back because he might be upset in a Brazilian prison. He might be tortured
exactly
or
the
hurt
same
or
reason.
mistreated. Exactly the same reason. Article 3, the prisons aren't good enough. He was allowed to stay free to roam. He was a delivery driver in London. So even though he's convicted of child abuse in Brazil, he's free in Britain. And while he's free, he reoffends. So he downloaded and distributed over 1,000 images of child abuse, the very worst images of child abuse as well, the worst category of them included in that. So that is where this whole argument about human rights comes into play, right? Because all of us want to protect our human rights.
Yeah, of course.
Nobody wants to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, forget about human rights, they're all a load of nonsense. Of course we don't. But what is the balance of rights here? You know, yes, we don't want someone to be tortured in prison, but on the other hand, we don't want another child to be abused by a perpetrator who gets to stay in the country and is free to roam. So this is where this argument about reform comes into play. Reform with a small r, not the capital R. The political party. Which we'll talk about in a minute, I'm sure.
Kind of peeked up and thought, what's he talking about? Where do they feature in this?
Yeah, I mean, well, they say just pull out of the European Convention on Human Rights altogether. And the counter-argument to that is no, reform with a small r, reform the European Convention on Human Rights instead, make it better, apply it better, and encourage judges to think about this balance in a new way so that we're not having these crazy situations.
I mean, exactly as you just said, we're talking about the worst kind of crimes that you and I can imagine as parents or anybody really. Murder, child rape. Within the current system, is there any crime that you can avoid? Any crime that you can avoid facing justice for if the prison conditions in your home country are bad enough? Yeah,
it doesn't matter what the crime is. The rights apply in the same way. Now, there are what's called absolute rights and qualified rights under the European Convention on Human Rights, which gets...
I'm impressed with the level of technical knowledge.
I've got to admit, I'm new to this game. I've learned this in the past 24 hours.
You're closing your eyes whilst you're saying it.
But it's quite important because a lot of the focus in these cases so far has been on what's called Article 8. Article 8 is about family life, the right to a family life, right? And that comes up all the time. So lots of our listeners and viewers will be familiar with cases where people say things like, you can't deport me because you'll break up my family, or, you can't deport me because my wife can't survive without me, and all that kind of stuff. That comes under Article 8 and is commonly cited, and there have been loads of cases that have gone into the political debate and been held up as signs that things have gone awry. That is a qualified right. Okay, so there's some flexibility there for a judge. The judge can say, well, yeah, I am worried about your family, but I'm also worried that you might reoffend, for example. They can be balanced out. Article 3, which we're talking about with these Brazilian fugitives, is an absolute right. That is a right you can never sort of, my understanding is, balance against anything else. It has to be completely protected. And you can kind of understand it, right? Nobody should be tortured, right? So that it feels like the right not to be tortured should be one of the top rights. But it means that it's really, really difficult for judges to do anything other than just apply it in a kind of purist way and just say, well, Article 3 applies here. Therefore, no matter what you've done, no matter who you are, no matter how dangerous you are, your right still applies, and we can't send you back. And that's what the government is looking at tinkering with. But it's hard.
Yeah. So many people listening, watching this week will be really shocked hearing about this. But you've also spoken to Jim Gamble, and I mean, I remember him from years ago, but he's a former senior police officer who ran the Child Exploitation Online Protection Command at the National Crime Agency, the NCA, didn't he? What did he have to say about it?
Well, he is really frustrated with the way that ECHR is working, because police officers, as you would expect, find this really frustrating. They want to arrest criminals, and when they do make the effort of arresting some of these fugitives, for example, then the courts throw out the case and they're allowed to stay here anyway. So it's no surprise, really, that Jim Gamble, with his background in policing, is really frustrated with the way the law is applying. And he makes exactly the argument we've just been discussing, that you've got to look at the whole picture here. You've got to balance these things out. It is absolutely bonkers just to look at one argument and say, well, Article 3 applies, therefore, no way, you're not going home. You've got to think about the rights of children not to be abused and all of the other factors that come into play. This is what he told me when I interviewed him earlier in the week.
We really do need this to be a wake-up call. What we're saying through the work that you have done is, here is an individual with a conviction for murder. Here is an individual who is convicted for child abuse offences, rape. Yet, notwithstanding that evidence of his bad character, someone within the system in the UK has said it's okay for him to stay.
What's the UK's government's response been to this in your report?
Okay, so there's argument here about what the best way forward is. As we mentioned earlier, Reform UK say just pull out. I've interviewed the leader of the Conservative Party as well, in her role, of course, as the leader of the official opposition, and she says, Kemi Badenoch, she is leaning increasingly towards pulling out of the ECHR as well as her policy. Right. And she said that our investigation has only persuaded her of that case. So the counter-argument is from Labour, and actually across Europe now too, lots of other European nations are struggling with this, because there's this massive immigration crisis, and I think we can call it a crisis, it's definitely a political crisis anyway, whether you think immigration is good or bad, or too high or too low, whatever. It's definitely a political crisis for lots of governments around Europe, and they're all sort of screaming at the Council of Europe, which is the body that kind of oversees the European Convention on Human Rights. They're screaming and saying, you've got to reform this. It's stopping us from tackling immigration in our country. We can't send people back to their home countries either because of the ECHR. That's where Labour is. Labour's going to, I would imagine our Labour government will join that camp of voices, about 9 other nations in Europe, all shouting for this. That's what the Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, is arguing this week. She's been in Strasbourg making the case, making a speech saying, please reform the ECHR. We need to reform it. So that's what they're hoping. But someone said to me today, which I think is really interesting.
Go on.
It's a bit like the Brexit debate all over again, where a much simpler argument is just pull out, leave, chuck the whole thing away. It's harder politically to make the case for tweak it, reform it, improve it. That stuff never really flies as much with voters. So I do think the Labour government's in a tricky position here.
But would that be better long term, the tweaking as opposed to just pulling out?
I suppose it depends on your view, right? And it depends on your view of Brexit. Whether
Am I putting you on the spot?
It depends whether you think Brexiting was the best thing or whether we could have reformed the EU. I mean, David Cameron gave it a go. But I think one thing I would just say is that the European Convention on Human Rights does protect a lot of us from a lot of bad things. And it was established in 1950. Its supporters would definitely make this argument. It was established in 1950 to stop the rise of fascism and Nazism again in Europe, right? It's there for a very good reason, which was that rights were completely violated and trashed during World War II. So I do think we've got to be mindful that if we withdraw from the ECHR, what are we going to replace it with to protect our rights in Britain? That's a big question.
Well, Paul, you've excelled yourself today with your level of technical and
Can I now be a
legal
barrister?
knowledge. I'm not sure. Thank you very much anyway. For more on Paul's investigation, head to itv.com/news. And remember to subscribe to What You Need to Know wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You can watch full episodes on Spotify, YouTube and ITVX. Until next time, thank you for joining us.